My wife was rubbing against another man right in front of me. When she called me jealous, I said, "I'm not jealous, I'm just done," and left the restaurant. My name is Tyler Brooks, and I'm 29 years old. By most people's standards, I've been living what you'd call the dream life. I work as a construction project manager, pulling in good money that lets me afford a nice house here in Miami. The eternal sunshine, the beaches, the perfect Instagram lifestyle. From the outside, everything looks exactly like it should. But tonight, something feels fundamentally off. I'm sitting here at my kitchen table, staring at this half-empty glass of whiskey, and for the fourth time this evening, that damn kitchen light keeps flickering. Normally, something like that wouldn't even register on my radar. It's just one of those subtle, annoying things that you mentally add to your weekend fix-it list. But for some reason, tonight it feels like the universe is trying to flash Morse code warnings at me, and I can't shake the feeling that I should be paying attention. The dishwasher is humming its usual tune, but what's really catching my attention is the sound drifting down from upstairs, her laughter echoing from our bedroom. Victoria is on the phone again, which has become her default position these days. She's always upstairs now, always behind that locked door, always laughing with that tight, breathy laugh that used to be reserved only for me. Now I hear it constantly, but never when she's actually talking to me. I don't go up to check anymore. There's no point. And honestly, my legs are stiff from another grueling day at work anyway. My fingers are still sore from gripping the steering wheel for 11 straight hours. I work for a freight logistics company, and the shifts are long, filled with silence and way too much time to think. That's probably the worst thing a man can do when the pieces of his life aren't adding up the way they used to. We used to spend Tuesday nights like this together, but in a completely different way. We'd sit on the couch with her legs draped across my lap, some terrible movie playing in the background that neither of us was really watching. She'd tease me mercilessly about my taste in snacks and throw pretzels in my direction when I defend my choices. That version of Victoria, the woman who hummed while brushing her teeth, who danced around our living room in fuzzy socks, who left little notes in my work bag, she hasn't been around in months. Instead, I have this stranger sleeping in my bed. She wears Victoria's perfume and uses Victoria's voice, but everything underneath the surface is completely different. It's like someone took the woman I fell in love with and replaced her with a carefully constructed replica that got most of the details right, but missed all the important parts that made her real. The first time I really noticed the crack in our relationship was during that weekend at her parents' place in Colorado. We'd made the trip for her mom's birthday, and everything should have felt normal and comfortable. But Victoria kept checking her phone every 8 minutes like clockwork. I started timing it without even meaning to, watching her eyes dart down to that screen with an urgency that had nothing to do with work or family emergencies. What made it even more obvious was how she'd flip the phone face down whenever I got anywhere near her. Not just when I was trying to look. Even if I was just walking past to grab a drink or use the bathroom, down it would go. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask if everything was okay, she rolled her eyes at me with this expression of pure annoyance and said, "Why are you acting so clingy?" The way she said it, with that dismissive little laugh, made me feel like I was being paranoid and needy for even noticing. I laughed it off at the time, told myself maybe I was being insecure. Maybe I was reading too much into innocent behavior. But here's the thing about patterns. Once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. They form these connecting lines in your mind, and suddenly all these little details that seemed random before start creating a very clear picture. The details that ended up haunting me the most were the small changes in her routine. She started going to the gym at these weird hours. Not her usual morning sessions, but random times in the evening when she'd never shown interest in working out before. Suddenly, she cared about getting her nails done every 2 weeks, when she used to go months between appointments. She started wearing lingerie that she'd always claimed was uncomfortable, pieces that had been sitting unworn in her drawer for over a year. Most disturbing of all was how she'd come home smelling like cologne that definitely wasn't mine. Not overpowering, just a faint trace that lingered when she'd brush past me or lean in for what felt like obligatory goodnight kisses. When you've been with someone for years, you know their scent better than your own. You know what they smell like after the gym, after work, after a shower. This was something else entirely, something foreign that had no business being on her skin. Last Thursday, everything changed in a way that made all my suspicions feel like child's play. My truck broke down during the route, which meant all my deliveries got canceled for the day. I didn't bother calling Victoria to tell her I was coming home early. It wasn't like we'd been communicating much lately anyway. and I figured I'd just surprise her by being there when she got back from work. When I opened the front door, I immediately heard music playing upstairs. That alone wasn't unusual. Victoria often had music on when she was getting ready or just relaxing, but these weren't her usual playlists. This was something new and unfamiliar, with a beat and energy that didn't match anything I'd ever heard her listen to before. I walked up the stairs slowly, my work boots thudding like war drums on each step. The sound echoed through the house in a way that should have announced my presence, but the music was loud enough that she clearly couldn't hear me coming. When I turned the corner toward our bedroom, I saw that the door was cracked open just slightly, not wide, but enough that I could see inside without being noticed. What I witnessed in that moment will probably stay burned in my memory forever. Victoria was dancing inside our bedroom, but this wasn't just casual swaying to the music while she folded laundry or got dressed. This was full-on, deliberate dancing. The kind of sensual, confident movement she used to only do for me when we were drunk and stupid in love, back in the early days when everything between us felt electric and new. Except she wasn't dancing for me. She was facing her phone, which was propped up on our dresser, recording herself like she was putting on some kind of performance. I watched her mouth words to the camera with this flirtatious smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Then she laughed, that same breathy laugh I'd been hearing through the bedroom door, blew a kiss directly at the camera, and pressed send. She had absolutely no idea I was standing there in the hallway, watching this intimate performance that was clearly meant for someone else. Every part of me was screaming not to back away, to confront her right then and there, to demand an explanation for what I was seeing. But I couldn't make myself move forward or speak. Instead, I did the most cowardly thing possible. I backed away quietly and left the house. I sat in my truck in our driveway for 3 hours that afternoon. I didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't even turn on the radio. I just stared straight ahead at nothing, trying to process what I'd witnessed and what it meant for everything I thought I knew about my relationship. The woman dancing in our bedroom wasn't the Victoria I'd been living with for months. She was alive and passionate and engaged in a way that made me realize just how dead and distant she'd become with me. The real moment everything shifted happened yesterday, and it's the kind of scene that plays on repeat in your mind, whether you want it to or not. I had decided to pick Victoria up from work as a surprise, something I used to do occasionally in the early days of our relationship, back when small gestures like that felt natural and appreciated. It was pouring rain, one of those heavy Miami downpours that turns the world gray and makes everything feel more dramatic than it should. I parked outside her office building, watching the wide shadows it cast across the parking lot while I waited. The windshield wipers were ticking back and forth in this steady, hypnotic rhythm that should have been soothing, but somehow made me feel more anxious. I kept checking the time, watching employees filter out of the building as the workday ended, scanning for Victoria's familiar silhouette. Then I saw her walking out, and immediately my stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. She was walking with some guy I'd never seen before. Tall, wearing an expensive leather jacket that probably cost more than I made in a week, with one of those easy, confident smiles that some men just seem to be born with. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just that she was walking beside him. She was close to him. Really close. Not the polite, professional distance you maintain with coworkers, but the kind of proximity that speaks to familiarity and comfort. As I watched, her hand actually touched his chest while they talked, a casual, intimate gesture that sent a shock of recognition through me. This wasn't their first conversation, and it definitely wasn't just friendly workplace banter. He leaned in to whisper something in her ear, and she responded with that laugh. That same damn laugh I'd been hearing through our bedroom door for weeks, the one that used to be mine but had become this mysterious sound that haunted our house. Seeing it attached to a face, to a specific person, made everything click into place in the most horrible way possible. Victoria spotted me sitting in the truck before I could even think about getting out to confront them. Our eyes locked for exactly 1 second. One whole second of recognition where I could see her processing that I was there, that I had witnessed this moment. Then she smiled at me. But it wasn't the smile of someone who was happy to see their boyfriend waiting to pick them up. It was the smile of someone who had just realized they'd been caught, but wasn't particularly concerned about it. There was something almost amused in her expression, like I was some joke she'd already gotten tired of telling. That smile told me everything I needed to know about how little I meant to her anymore. I didn't make a scene in that parking lot, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of the truck and demand answers. Instead, I drove her home in complete silence. The rain still pounding against the windshield, and both of us pretending that nothing significant had just happened. She acted like it was just another normal day, even humming softly to herself as we drove. When we got home, Victoria made chicken pasta for dinner like she did every Tuesday. She asked me how my day went, using the same tone she always used, as if she genuinely cared about my answer. She kissed me on the cheek and called me babe, just like always. And I let her do it all, playing along with this charade because I wasn't ready to face what acknowledging the truth would mean for both of us. But tonight, while she's upstairs giggling behind those locked doors like she has been every evening for weeks, I'm sitting here at this kitchen table with her old phone in my hands. It's the phone she left behind when she upgraded to a new model last month, and she clearly thinks it's completely wiped clean of any evidence. She couldn't be more wrong about that. This old phone is far from wiped. There are messages on here, hundreds and hundreds of them that paint a picture I never wanted to see. Photos, voice recordings, video clips, and entire conversations that reveal a completely different version of the woman I thought I knew. But it's one particular message thread that makes my blood run cold, and it contains a line that will probably haunt me forever. He's too dumb to figure it out. I didn't move for a long time after reading that. I just sat here at this same kitchen table, her old phone clutched in my hand so tightly that the blood drained from my fingers while I held it. The screen stayed lit as I scrolled through message after message, each one peeling back another layer of the lie I'd been living in for months without even realizing it. The messages reveal an entire secret relationship between Victoria and someone whose name is saved as Blake Fitness in her contacts. Real subtle, right? What I discovered buried in that little chat bubble was evidence of a whole second life that she'd been carefully constructing behind my back. The timestamps go back months, revealing a timeline of deception that makes me question every single interaction we've had recently. March 5th. He still thinks I'm going to Pilates class, LOL. That message hit me like a physical blow because I remembered that day perfectly. She'd come home in workout clothes, slightly sweaty, complaining about how intense the class had been. I'd even offered to rub her shoulders because she said she was sore from all the stretching. March 12th. Told him I'm exhausted so I can sneak over after dinner. I remember that night too. She'd claimed she had a headache and went to bed early, leaving me to clean up the kitchen and watch TV alone. I'd even brought her aspirin and water, trying to be considerate of what I thought was genuine fatigue. March 18th. He wanted to watch a movie tonight. Like we're still 22 or something. Reading that message made me want to scream, because I remembered suggesting we have a movie night together. I'd thought it would be nice to spend some quality time together, since we'd been feeling distant lately. She'd rolled her eyes and said she wasn't in the mood, leaving me to watch alone while she went upstairs to read. March 20th. There's a video attachment that I couldn't bring myself to press play on. I physically couldn't make my finger tap that screen to see what was contained in that file. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and I wasn't ready to cross that line yet. But it wasn't just the evidence of her affair that destroyed me. It was the way she talked about me throughout these conversations, like I was some pathetic extra in a sitcom she was stuck performing in. She made cruel jokes about my daily routines, mocked my job, and the long hours I worked to support our lifestyle. She even ridiculed the fact that I still pack her lunch on Fridays and set up her coffee the night before, so she'd wake up to the smell in the morning. Every single small act of love, every little gesture I thought was holding us together and showing her how much I cared. She had turned all of it into material for her entertainment. She wasn't just tired of our relationship or bored with our routine. She was genuinely disgusted by it, disgusted by me, and she'd been sharing that disgust with a stranger who was helping her mock the very foundation of our life together. At some point while I was sitting there processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered, I realized that the silence upstairs had changed. The giggling and muffled phone conversations had stopped, and when I looked up from the damning evidence in my hands, Victoria was standing at the top of the stairs. She was holding a glass of wine, just watching me sit there with this casual, almost bored expression on her face. She must have heard the kitchen drawer open when I found the old phone hidden in there among the takeout menus and spare batteries. How long had she been standing there, observing me discover her secret life? The thought that she might have been watching me unravel in real time made my skin crawl. "You going through my stuff now?" she asked, her tone so casual and almost bored that it felt like she was commenting on the weather. There was no panic in her voice, no surprise, no guilt. It was like this was some minor inconvenience that had interrupted her evening routine. I didn't say anything back to her at first. I just held up the phone so she could see exactly what I had in my hands. I wanted her to understand that whatever game she'd been playing, Whatever lies she'd been telling herself about how clever and careful she was being. It was all over now. She didn't flinch when she saw the phone. She didn't try to deny what was on it or scramble to come up with some explanation that might make sense. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine, leaned against the railing with this infuriating sense of calm, and said something that will echo in my head for the rest of my life. If you're looking for a reason to feel sorry for yourself, I guess you found it. My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I could hear it in my ears. But somehow I managed to stay completely still. Her tone wasn't angry at all. It was cruel and deliberate, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The big reveal. Like finally being caught gave her some kind of power over me that she'd been craving. I wanted to tell you, she added, walking down the stairs slowly, each step measured and confident. But you're so sensitive lately. I figured you'd break down and make it all about you. The way she said it, like my potential emotional response to discovering her betrayal, was just another inconvenience she didn't want to deal with, made me realize I was looking at a complete stranger. Who is he? I managed to ask, my voice tight and strained, but somehow still steady. She rolled her eyes at the question like I was asking something incredibly tedious. Don't do this, she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. Who is he, Victoria? I repeated, putting more force behind the words this time. She walked right past me like I was a piece of furniture, opened the refrigerator, and grabbed the wine bottle to refill her glass. The casual nature of her movements, like she was just refreshing her drink after a long day at the spa, made the surreal nature of this confrontation even more disturbing. His name's Blake, she said finally, not even bothering to look at me while she spoke. He's a real man. He doesn't need to beg for attention. Doesn't sit around waiting for crumbs like some lost puppy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me, leaving me suspended in this nightmare where 7 years of our life together meant absolutely nothing. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built a future with, was standing in our kitchen describing me like I was some pathetic stranger who had been inconveniencing her for months. I gave you everything, I said, my voice tight and strained with the effort of keeping myself together. 7 years of my life, of building something I thought was real, of working overtime to afford this house and this lifestyle, of showing up even when things got difficult between us. No, she snapped back without even a moment's hesitation. You gave me routine, boredom, safety. You gave me predictable. I needed more than that. I wanted someone who actually sees me. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel this heat rising in me that I'd never experienced before. I stood up from the kitchen table and took a step toward her, but she didn't back away even an inch. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the fact that she was finally getting a reaction out of me. He sees you? I asked, putting as much skepticism as I could manage into those 3 words. Or just what you let him see. For the first time since this conversation started, her smile faded just a little bit. That mask of complete indifference cracked for a brief moment, and I caught a glimpse of something underneath. Maybe uncertainty, maybe guilt. But she recovered quickly, rebuilding that wall of cold superiority almost instantly. Don't act like some victim, she said, her voice taking on an even sharper edge. You stopped being interesting a long time ago. There it was. The sentence that burned hotter than all the lies and betrayals combined. Not that she'd fallen out of love with me, not that we'd grown apart, not that she'd made a mistake. I had simply stopped being worth her attention. Stopped being someone she considered worthy of basic respect and honesty. I walked out of that house for the second time in 2 days, but this time I didn't just go to the porch or sit in the driveway staring at nothing. I got in my truck and drove, with no destination in mind and no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and the toxic atmosphere that our home had become. I needed space, movement, air that didn't smell like her perfume and wasn't poisoned with her casual cruelty. I ended up in an empty parking lot behind a closed burger joint on the other side of town. I sat there with the engine off, her words still echoing in my head like some kind of twisted mantra. I pressed my hands to my eyes so hard that I saw stars, trying to physically block out the memory of her voice saying those things. This wasn't just betrayal in the traditional sense. This was complete erasure of everything I thought we'd built together. She didn't just cheat on me. She had systematically rewritten the entire history of our relationship, burying every good memory under layers of sarcasm and disdain. Every moment I'd treasured, every gesture of love I'd thought meant something, every time I'd felt grateful for what we had together. She'd turned all of it into evidence of my inadequacy, But sitting there in that empty parking lot, staring at the neon signs of closed businesses and listening to the distant hum of late-night traffic, I realized something important. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. This wasn't going to end with me broken and defeated, accepting her version of events and slinking away like the pathetic man she clearly thought I was. I was going to take control of this situation, and I was going to do it on my terms. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed parked in that burger joint parking lot until the sky shifted from black to gray. That particular kind of gray that makes the world feel hollow and drained of color. I watched the sun try to break through clouds that refused to let it shine, and somehow that felt symbolic of everything that was happening in my life. Everything did now. Every random detail seemed to carry weight and meaning that it never had before. I drove back home just before 7 a.m., timing my return so I could see whether Victoria's car was still in the driveway. It was, and there were lights on upstairs in our bedroom. What struck me as particularly telling was that she didn't even try to call me during those long hours I was gone. No texts, no missed calls, no voicemails asking where I was or if I was okay. Just complete silence, like my absence from our home didn't even register as noteworthy. That silence was actually worse than if she had tried to reach out. The absolute absence of effort or concern told me everything I needed to know about how little I meant to her at this point. I wasn't even worth a perfunctory check-in after walking out during the biggest fight of our relationship. When I walked back into the house, Victoria was stationed at the kitchen island, casually scrolling on her tablet like it was just another regular Wednesday morning. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she was wearing a hoodie that I didn't recognize. Definitely not one of mine. Her bare feet were planted on the cold tiles, and she looked completely relaxed and unbothered, like nothing had burned down between us just hours ago. She didn't say anything when I came through the door. She looked up once, blinked at me with mild interest, and then returned her attention to whatever she was reading on her screen. After a few moments of this surreal normalcy, she finally spoke. "Are you going to mope forever?" I stared at her for a long second, trying to process the casual cruelty of that question. Here I was, having spent the night processing the complete destruction of our relationship, and her primary concern was whether my emotional response was going to inconvenience her schedule. "I read everything," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. She shrugged like it was no big deal, like I just told her I'd finished reading the newspaper. "So what now? You want to cry about it?" I took a step forward, feeling something shift inside me. "No, I want the truth." Her expression changed briefly, just a flicker of discomfort before that cold veneer returned like armor. "You want truth?" she said slowly, like she was savoring the opportunity to deliver what came next. "You stopped being a man years ago. You started acting like some background character in your own life. I begged you to take initiative, to do something new, be someone. You didn't. You wanted safe, comfortable. I got bored. So your solution was to throw it all away behind my back?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "No," she snapped, her tone taking on that sharp edge I was becoming familiar with. "My solution was to remember who I was before I met you. And you know what? I liked her more." I couldn't speak for a moment, not because I was stunned. I was beyond that point now, but because I didn't recognize this woman anymore. The bitterness in her tone was so sharp and precise that it felt rehearsed, like she'd been building this speech for months, waiting for the moment I'd finally corner her with evidence just so she could spit it out and be free. "I've been paying the mortgage, working overtime," I said, my voice quieter now but carrying more weight than when I'd been shouting. "I've been showing up even when you didn't. I made this life for us." "No," she said flatly without even a moment's consideration. "You made it for yourself. I just played along until I couldn't stand it anymore." She walked away after delivering that final blow, like the conversation was over and her part in this drama was done. Like she'd said everything she needed to say, and now it was time to move on to more important things. I stood in that kitchen alone, her words hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear, poisoning everything they touched. I could have fought her then, could have screamed, thrown things, demanded she explain how 7 years of building a life together had been reduced to me being selfish and her just playing along. But what would that have proven? In her mind, I was already defeated. That much was crystal clear from the way she delivered her verdict with such cold certainty. The problem was, she thought this was the end of the story. She thought she delivered the final word and could now move forward with her new life, leaving me to pick up the pieces of my shattered assumptions. But she didn't know several crucial things that were about to change the dynamic of this situation completely. She didn't know that I'd been recording everything on her old phone, that I'd forwarded every message, every photo, every cruel little quote to myself before she could think to check whether the device was actually as wiped as she believed. She didn't know that I'd already found Blake's real name through the breadcrumbs she'd left in those messages. Not Blake Fitness, like he was saved in her contacts, but Blake Morrison, a married accountant with a newborn baby at home. Most importantly, she didn't know that I'd been talking with Blake's wife since 3 a.m., sharing screenshots and building a case that would destroy both of their carefully constructed secret world. I wasn't just a man unraveling anymore. I was a man rebuilding, brick by jagged brick, and I was completely done playing the fool. The message I sent to Blake's wife had been direct and to the point. No emotional manipulation, no fluff, just screenshots, timestamps, and a short note. I thought you deserved to know who your husband's been spending his evenings with. I'd expected panic from her, maybe even silence while she processed the information. But within 12 minutes of hitting send, my phone was ringing. "My name is Catherine," she said when I answered, and I could already hear the cracking beneath the surface of her voice. I knew something was off, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't need to say much during that conversation. The screenshot spoke louder than anything I could have told her. Photos of Victoria and Blake in hotel rooms, messages about how they'd never go back once their divorces were final, detailed plans to spend weekends in Sonoma, cruel jokes about how they both deserved better than the leftovers they were currently stuck with. We talked for over an hour, both of us careful, not with each other, because we were strangers united in the same storm, but with the pieces of ourselves we hadn't realized were breaking until we tried to examine them. Catherine cried once during that call, and I found myself oddly grateful that I didn't. My tears were long gone. What I had left was focus, clarity, and a plan that was already taking shape in my mind. When Catherine and I hung up, I finally stood up from that kitchen table where I'd been sitting for what felt like hours. The house was too quiet now. Victoria was gone, probably at his place to celebrate or maybe to cry in his arms now that her double life was cracking open at the seams. I didn't care anymore which it was. I walked to our bedroom and opened the closet, surveying Victoria's side with new eyes. It looked strangely untouched, like someone had set up a showroom version of her life and never actually lived in it. Everything was organized and pristine, in a way that felt artificial now that I knew how much deception had been hiding beneath the surface. I started pulling her stuff out methodically. Bags, jackets, shoes that still had little price stickers on the soles from recent shopping trips I'd never heard about. One by one, I piled everything in the hallway, creating a growing mountain of evidence of a life I'd been financially supporting while being emotionally excluded from. Then I found the box. It was a small wooden box, hidden behind old sweaters she never wore, carefully taped shut with clear packing tape like it contained something precious. My hands were shaking slightly as I peeled away the tape, not knowing what I might discover but certain it would be significant. Inside were letters from me. Birthday notes, anniversary cards, sticky notes with dumb little jokes I used to leave in her lunch bag. Every written expression of love I'd given her over the years. She'd kept them all, which initially made my heart skip with hope. Maybe there was still some part of her that remembered what we'd meant to each other. But then I realized what I was actually looking at. Every single piece of paper had been ripped in half. Each letter, each card, each note was folded neatly and then torn straight down the middle with surgical precision. She hadn't thrown them out in a moment of anger or cleaning frenzy. No, she'd kept them specifically so she could methodically destroy them, savoring the satisfaction of ripping apart every gesture of love I'd ever made. The cuts were intentional and deliberate, like she'd taken time with each one to ensure the tear was clean and complete. This wasn't accidental damage or careless handling. This was systematic destruction, performed with care and attention to detail. I stared at that pile of halved memories, feeling a heat rise in me that I hadn't known I was capable of. This wasn't heartbreak anymore. This wasn't even anger in any recognizable form. This was war, and she'd been fighting it alone while I'd been completely unaware that a battle was even taking place. I took that box and walked it straight to the fire pit in our backyard. I lit a match and watched every page curl inward and vanish into ash, feeling something settle in my chest that might have been peace, or might have been the calm that comes before a storm. When Victoria came home that night, she didn't ask why her clothes were packed in trash bags lined up in the hallway. She didn't question why her perfume bottles were arranged on the porch railing like some kind of surrender flag. She just looked at me like I was a child throwing a tantrum. like this display of backbone was amusing rather than threatening. "You think this makes you strong?" she said, surveying the scene with obvious disdain. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "No, but it makes me done." She scoffed and tried to walk past me toward the front door, but I stepped directly in front of it, blocking her path. "You're not sleeping here tonight," I said, with more authority than I'd felt in months. "You're not stepping foot in this house again unless a lawyer says you can." She actually laughed out loud at that, like I'd just told her the most ridiculous joke she'd ever heard. "Wow, you found your spine. Too bad it's too late for you." "I already was," I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You just filled the silence with lies." She left after that exchange, slamming the car door like it meant something, like the force of it could somehow communicate the depth of her indignation at being held accountable for her actions. I watched her drive away without feeling any emotion, just the dull relief of fresh air entering a room that had been rotting for years without anyone acknowledging the smell. I had the locks changed the next morning, but the real revenge hadn't even started yet. What Victoria didn't understand was that her casual cruelty had awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. A sense of self-preservation and strategic thinking that I'd apparently abandoned somewhere along the way. I met with a lawyer at 9:30 a.m. sharp. He came recommended by a friend who'd gone through a brutal divorce the year before, and his reputation preceded him. Lewis Manning was a quiet, sharp man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and cold eyes, the kind of guy who didn't blink unless it helped him win something. His office felt like a war room, and I knew immediately that I'd found the right person for what was coming. I sat across from his imposing desk and handed him the stack of documents I'd printed from Victoria's old phone. Photos, messages, receipts, travel records, everything I'd been able to gather that painted a clear picture of her deception and planning. He flipped through them slowly, methodically, like he was reading a grocery list rather than evidence of a relationship's destruction. When he finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed, but there was something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. "This isn't going to be hard," he said, with the confidence of someone who'd seen this scenario play out dozens of times before. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those words until they hit me. For weeks, I'd felt like I was drowning in uncertainty and self-doubt. Having a professional tell me that I had a clear path forward felt like being thrown a lifeline. "I want everything done by the book," I told him, leaning forward to emphasize my seriousness. "No screaming matches, no drama. I want it quiet, clean, and irreversible." "You'll need to move fast," Lewis replied, already reaching for his legal pad to start taking notes. "If she's planning to run off with this guy, we file first. We set the tone of how this whole process unfolds." "Do it," I said without hesitation. Victoria was still living in some fantasy where she held all the power in this situation. She still thought she could control the narrative and manage the fallout on her own terms. But now, I had the leverage, I had the evidence, and most importantly, I had Catherine, who was more than willing to testify about what her husband had been doing behind her back. During our subsequent phone calls, Catherine had sent me even more damaging messages from Blake's side of their affair. It turned out they'd been planning their new life together for over 4 months, carefully coordinating their stories and even laughing about what they'd say in court if their deceptions were ever discovered. They'd been treating the destruction of 2 marriages like some kind of elaborate game. But Catherine dropped an even bigger bomb during our 3rd phone call. "He's been shifting money between accounts at work," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. I didn't want to believe it when I first found the files, but Blake's not just cheating. He's embezzling money from his company. She sent me copies of everything she'd discovered, and I forwarded them directly to Lewis. When he saw the financial documents, he allowed himself the smallest smile I'd seen from him yet. "Looks like we might not be the only ones ending a marriage," he said. This could get very interesting very quickly. I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in months. There was something profoundly satisfying about having a clear plan of action after weeks of feeling like I was drowning in uncertainty and betrayal. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny rather than being swept along by Victoria's manipulations. Victoria texted me around 9:15 p.m., and I could practically hear the false sweetness in her written words. "I want to come by tomorrow and talk. Just talk. Please don't make this ugly." I didn't answer her. Lewis had advised complete radio silence until the legal proceedings were underway, and I was more than happy to follow that guidance. Let her wonder what I was thinking, what I was planning, what evidence I might have gathered. For once, she could be the one sitting in uncertainty. The next day, I deliberately left the house before she arrived. Lewis had been very specific about this strategy. Let her talk to silence. Let her see the distance for yourself. I wanted her to experience what it felt like to reach out and find nothing there, to finally understand what I'd been going through for months. I watched the whole encounter unfold on my phone through our security camera feed. She let herself in with the spare key I'd forgotten to disable, walking through our living room like she expected something to collapse back into her arms. When nothing did, when the house remained cold and empty, I could see the annoyance growing on her face through the grainy camera footage. She texted me again while she was still in the house. Is this how you're going to play it? After everything I gave you? The ego, the sheer audacity of that message, almost made me laugh. Even now, even after being caught red-handed in months of deception and cruelty, she was still trying to position herself as the injured party. She genuinely believed she was the one who had been wronged in this situation. By Friday, the petition for divorce had been served. Lewis had made sure it happened while Victoria was still at work, having it delivered directly to her desk where her coworkers could witness her receiving it. The envelope was still warm from the courier's hand when she signed for it, and there was no warning, no discussion, no opportunity for her to prepare or spin the narrative. Just a legal declaration that she was now officially the respondent in a divorce proceeding, and that word carried all the weight Lewis had intended it to. She was no longer driving this process. She was responding to actions I had taken. Victoria showed up at the house that night without calling or sending any warning message. I didn't open the door when she started pounding on it, and she kept at it for 6 full minutes. I timed it, listening to her bang on the wood and yell my name while calling me a coward and a manipulator. She said I was throwing everything away over a few texts, which showed that she still fundamentally misunderstood the magnitude of what she'd done. The irony of her calling me manipulative while standing on the porch of a house she'd been using as a home base for her secret affair made me laugh out loud from behind the curtain where I was watching. "You made this ugly!" she screamed at the closed door. "You ruined us!" And then came the shift I'd been waiting for. The mask that had stayed so firmly in place during our kitchen confrontation finally dropped completely, and I heard her break down. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking with what sounded like genuine desperation. "Please don't do this. We can fix it." "Can." But I knew better now. Her tears weren't regret for what she'd done to me or to our relationship. They were fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. She'd built her whole strategy around the assumption that I would be too weak or too attached to fight back effectively. I let her stand there in that emotional breakdown without responding. I didn't speak, didn't open the door, didn't give her any indication that her pain was affecting me. I watched her crumble and walk back to her car alone, and it was the first time I'd seen her without the act, without the carefully constructed persona she'd been wearing for months. It was also the first time I realized that the woman I'd fallen in love with might never have existed at all. By Monday morning, everything had shifted again in ways that even I hadn't anticipated. Victoria didn't go to work that day, and I only knew this because Catherine had messaged me with an update. She still had a friend working in the same office building, and word travels fast in professional environments when someone gets served divorce papers in front of their coworkers. According to Catherine's source, Victoria had apparently left work early on Friday, after spending time crying in the restroom following the delivery of the legal documents. Then, she simply never came back. The image of her standing in that sterile office environment, envelope in hand, finally realizing that the show was over and she was no longer controlling the script. It should have brought me some sense of satisfaction or closure, but all I felt was silence. Not the oppressive, anxiety-inducing silence that had filled our house for months, but something cleaner and more complete. It was the silence that comes after a storm has passed, and you can finally assess the damage without rain still pounding against the windows. I'd moved into a short-term rental across town by this point, a small place with clean lines and neutral walls. There were no photos of us anywhere, no scent of her perfume clinging to the air, no reminders of the life I'd thought we were building together. For the first time in years, I could sit on a couch and not wonder what I'd done wrong that day or what mood I'd find her in when she came home. There was space here. Space in my head, space in my chest, and space in my calendar that wasn't filled with the exhausting work of trying to manage someone else's emotional volatility. I didn't tell anyone except my brother about the separation, not even my parents. I wanted a clean break without a Greek chorus of well-meaning opinions and advice trailing behind me. Victoria tried to reach out again the next night, this time through email rather than showing up unannounced. "We don't have to do this like strangers," she wrote. "You've made your point. I understand now. Can we talk just once like adults? I didn't respond to that email either. The time for adult conversations had passed when she decided to conduct an affair while making jokes about my intelligence to her lover. She'd forfeited her right to reasonable discourse when she chose cruelty over honesty. Wednesday morning brought another call from Catherine, and her voice was shaking with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite identify. Blake's been suspended, she said without preamble. His company found out about everything. Someone sent them the files. She didn't ask if it had been me who forwarded Blake's financial irregularities to his employer. She already knew, and there was no judgment in her voice, just a kind of grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served. They're launching a full audit, Catherine continued. He's probably going to lose everything. His job, his professional reputation, maybe even face criminal charges depending on what they find. Catherine wasn't gloating about her husband's downfall. If anything, she sounded heartbroken. But not for him. She was mourning the wreckage he'd left behind. They had a baby, a house, a life she'd thought was still unfolding according to plan. Now she was facing the reality that everything she'd built her future around had been constructed on lies. I asked if she needed anything, and she said, no, just closure. That word stayed with me for hours after we hung up. Closure. Such a simple concept, but so difficult to achieve when you're still in the middle of the wreckage. That night, Victoria finally showed up at my new place. I hadn't given her the address, which meant she must have followed me from work, or somehow tracked me down through other means. I had just finished a quiet dinner when the knock came, and when I opened the door, there she was, rain in her hair, makeup smudged, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. Please, she said, stepping forward before I could even process her presence. Please just give me 5 minutes. Against my better judgment, I let her in. She walked into my living room and looked around like she didn't recognize the world anymore. Everything here was clean, simple, uncluttered by the emotional debris that had filled our shared spaces for months. You really moved on, she whispered, and there was something almost like wonder in her voice. I started, I replied, keeping my response minimal and honest. She nodded slowly, then turned to face me with an expression I hadn't seen in months. I didn't think you had it in you, she admitted. I thought you'd yell, cry, beg. But you just disappeared. I didn't disappear, I corrected her. I realized I was already gone in your mind. I just made it real. She started pacing around my small living room, rubbing her arms like she was cold despite the warm evening. I didn't mean for it to get so far, she said, her voice taking on a quality I hadn't heard since the early days of our relationship. I was confused. I thought I wanted more. I thought Victoria, I cut her off before she could finish that sentence. You don't get to do this part. She stopped pacing and looked at me with confusion. You don't get to come here now and paint yourself as confused, I continued. You weren't confused when you lied to me for months. When you laughed at me in those messages. When you talked about me like I was a joke to be shared with your lover. She stopped moving entirely, and her face hardened again as that familiar defensive mask started to slide back into place. So that's it, she said. You're done. I was done the moment I saw how much you enjoyed hurting me, I replied without hesitation. She stared at me for a long time, and I could see her processing this new version of me. The one who didn't bend to accommodate her emotions, who didn't scramble to fix things that she had broken. Then she stepped closer, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd once thought I loved. I made a mistake, she said softly. A terrible one, but we were real once. That has to mean something. It did, I acknowledged, but not anymore. What do you mean? I buried that version of us, I said, meeting her eyes directly, and you helped me dig the grave. The silence that followed was complete and final. She left without another word, and this time I didn't watch her go. I just stood there staring out the window, realizing how light the air felt without her presence poisoning it. I didn't see Victoria for days after that last conversation, and the silence was complicated in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't peaceful, not yet. It was more like standing in the ruins of a collapsed building. The noise is gone, sure, but the dust still hangs in the air. You can breathe, but it hurts with each inhale. Victoria tried calling twice more over the next few days. I didn't pick up either time, and what struck me as particularly telling was that she didn't leave voicemails. Just silence that stretched wide and long between us, speaking volumes about how little she actually had left to say. She stopped trying after that, and that absence of effort was actually the loudest answer I could have asked for. I went back to work, and routine became my refuge in ways I hadn't anticipated. Morning coffee, planning routes, making deliveries, the familiar smell of cardboard and diesel, the occasional small talk with shop owners who had no idea my world had imploded. It grounded me for hours at a time, allowing me to forget the sound of her voice and the weight of her betrayals. But then came an email that reminded me the fallout was far from over. The subject line read, "Urgent," your name came up, and it was from one of Victoria's co-workers, a woman named Stephanie, whom I'd only met twice at office parties. Inside was a simple but chilling message. "I know this is none of my business, but I overheard Victoria talking to someone in the break room today. She's saying you're unstable, that you fabricated evidence, that you're trying to ruin her professionally because you're bitter. Just wanted you to know what's being said. Be careful." I stared at that email for a long time, feeling something in me that wanted to march down to her office building and confront her. I wanted to make a scene, demand she explain how I had become the villain in a story she had authored through lies and manipulation. But I didn't act on that impulse. Instead, I forwarded the email to Lewis. He called me back within 12 minutes, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he spoke. "She's panicking," he said, with the confidence of someone who'd seen this pattern before. "She knows the leverage is gone, so now she's building a fallback story. Is this defamation?" I asked. "Can we do something about it?" "Not unless it escalates significantly," Lewis replied. "Right now it's just workplace gossip. So what do we do?" He paused for a moment, and I could practically hear him smiling through the phone. "Let her burn herself out. People who are desperate make mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities. That was the first night I slept a full 7 hours in months." There was something deeply comforting about knowing that her attempts to control the narrative were actually working against her. A few days later, Catherine reached out again, and her tone was completely different. Lighter, more hopeful than I'd heard since this whole situation began. She told me she'd filed for divorce officially, and that she and Blake were now sleeping in separate rooms. She was staying with her sister while the legal proceedings moved forward. She sounded exhausted but free, like someone who had finally stopped holding her breath after months of suffocation. "I keep thinking I should have done it sooner," she said, and I understood that sentiment completely. That week, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I drove out to the cabin, a place that was technically mine, left to me by my uncle years ago. It was a quiet retreat about 3 hours north of Miami, barely more than a rustic cabin, but it had always represented peace to me. Victoria had always hated it, claiming it was too quiet, too rustic, too far from civilization, and all the distractions she seemed to need. I packed a weekend bag, turned off my phone completely, and left for the cabin without telling anyone where I was going. When I arrived, everything smelled like pine and thyme, that particular scent of wood and dust and memories that had been sitting undisturbed. There was dust on the shelves, but nothing felt broken. Nothing felt contaminated by recent events. I lit the old fireplace, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch just breathing. And that's when it hit me with startling clarity. The real weight I'd been carrying wasn't what Victoria had done to me. It wasn't even the betrayal itself, devastating as that had been. The real damage was who I'd become while trying to hold on to someone who had stopped holding back months ago. Every joke I'd held in because I was afraid it might annoy her. Every time I'd forgiven without receiving an apology. Every piece of myself I'd trimmed away to fit her constantly shifting mold of what she wanted me to be. That was the true destruction. Not what she'd taken from me, but what I'd given away trying to keep someone who was already gone. I had to relearn what silence meant. Not the oppressive absence that had filled our house, but actual space. Room to think, to exist, to be myself without constantly calculating how my presence might affect someone else's mood. At the cabin, I read books I'd been meaning to get to for years. I wrote in a journal, something I hadn't done since college. I sat still without needing to fill every moment with activity or distraction. I watched the water move and realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't replaying the things she'd said. I wasn't imagining her with him. I wasn't spiraling into obsessive thoughts about what I could have done differently. I just existed, and that was enough. When I got back to town after the weekend, there was a letter waiting at my door. No return address, no name on the envelope. Inside was a single sentence written in her handwriting. "You'll never find someone who loved you like I did." I laughed out loud while standing alone in my hallway. Then I tossed the letter in the trash without a moment's hesitation, because she was finally right about something. I would never find someone like her again, and that was exactly the point. I didn't want someone who confused manipulation with love, who thought cruelty was an acceptable form of communication, who believed that loving someone meant you had the right to destroy them when they became inconvenient. A few days later, I saw her at the grocery store of all places. Fluorescent lights, stale air conditioning, rows of cereal boxes. The most mundane setting imaginable for what would turn out to be our final encounter. She was walking down the frozen aisle with that same stiff posture she'd always had when things didn't go her way. Eyes forward, mouth tight, hair pulled up in a knot that looked thrown together rather than styled. She wasn't glowing anymore. There was no makeup, no polish, no carefully curated image. Just raw exhaustion and the kind of deflation that comes when reality finally catches up with fantasy. She didn't see me at first, so I watched her from behind the glass door of the freezer section, pretending to examine frozen vegetables while studying this woman who had once been the center of my universe. She moved slower than usual, less purposefully. There was no phone in her hand, no clicking of heels, no confident laugh echoing through the aisles. Just silence and the mechanical hum of the store's refrigeration systems. Then she turned and saw me standing there. Our eyes locked for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. And for once, she didn't look angry or smug or emotionally distant. She looked embarrassed. There was something almost vulnerable in her expression that I hadn't seen in months. I didn't smile at her. I didn't nod or acknowledge her presence in any way. I just looked back, keeping my expression neutral and calm. Not cold, not cruel, just still. After a moment of this wordless staring contest, she approached me. She had no cart, nothing in her hands, and her movements seemed hesitant in a way that was completely unlike the confident woman I'd lived with. "Hi," she said simply. "Hey," I replied, matching her minimal energy. There was a long pause where neither of us seemed to know what came next in this script. "You look different," she said finally, studying my face with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. "Lighter." "I am," I confirmed without elaborating. She swallowed hard and looked down at the floor tiles, and I could see her gathering courage for whatever she was about to say. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice softer than I'd heard it in ages. I waited, not offering any encouragement or prompting. "I lost more than I thought I would," she continued, her voice taking on a quality that sounded dangerously close to tears. "Not just the house or you. I lost respect from people I never expected to lose it from. My boss demoted me after the whole situation became office gossip. People don't talk to me the same way anymore." I nodded slowly, not with sympathy but with acknowledgement. "That happens when you lie to everyone around you," I said matter-of-factly. She flinched at the directness of that statement, but she didn't argue with it. "I didn't think it would spiral like this," she whispered, and there was genuine confusion in her voice, like she truly hadn't considered that actions might have consequences beyond her immediate desires. "You didn't think at all," I replied, and again, I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just stating what seemed obvious. Another stretch of silence passed between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had been destroyed. "I keep replaying everything," she admitted, her voice barely audible now. "Wondering why I did it. What I was trying to prove." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You found someone better, didn't you?" She shook her head slowly, and for the first time, I saw something that might have been genuine regret in her expression. "Blake left," she said. "Said it was too much. That it was all too exposed. He blamed me for the audit, for the fallout at his job. Said I made him reckless. I didn't even blink at this revelation." "You both were reckless," I said. "Just not in the way you thought." Her lip trembled slightly, and I realized she was fighting back tears. "I didn't think I'd end up alone," she whispered. "But that's the thing," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "You were never with anyone. You were with illusions, control, games, masks. You lost the one person who saw everything and still stayed." A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "I was cruel," she admitted, and this was the first completely honest thing she'd said to me in months. And I told myself I wasn't. I kept telling myself it was your fault. I felt empty, but it wasn't. I nodded, acknowledging her admission. "That's the first honest thing you've said in months." She looked down at the floor again, clearly struggling with whatever she wanted to ask next. "Would you ever forgive me?" she finally whispered. I took a breath, considering her question carefully. "I already did," I said. She looked up, stunned by my response, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since our conversation had started. "Not for you," I clarified before she could misinterpret my words. "For me." The hope died immediately, replaced by confusion. "I forgave you so I wouldn't carry you into the next part of my life," I explained. "Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the fire. It means you finally understand the burn was never your fault." And with that, I turned away from her. I grabbed a bag of frozen green beans from the freezer, placed them in my basket, and walked away without looking back. Because forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the source of your pain. It means freeing yourself from the weight of carrying that pain forward. It had been exactly 94 days since Victoria had walked out of our home for the last time. 94 days since the lies had stopped echoing in our hallway, since I'd stopped scanning every text notification with suspicion, since I'd stopped waking up at 3:30 a.m., wondering why her body wasn't curled into mine anymore. The difference now was profound. I didn't wonder about those things anymore. I didn't miss them. I didn't need them. The emotional dependency that had defined so much of our relationship had been completely severed. The court date came and went without any drama whatsoever. Victoria didn't contest the divorce proceedings, and in fact, she didn't say anything at all during the brief hearing. Lewis told me afterward that it was one of the fastest, uncontested proceedings he'd ever seen. "She's finished playing," he explained as we walked out of the courthouse. "There's no more power left for her to squeeze out of this situation." And he was absolutely right. She signed the papers, she faded from my life, and it was done. No grand gestures, no final confrontations, no dramatic declarations. Just signatures on legal documents and the quiet closing of a chapter that had gone on far too long. The house sold a week later to a young couple, a pregnant wife and a wide-eyed husband who talked about their future like it was something tangible and bright. I handed them the keys with a straight face, but as I drove away for the final time, I thought about every inch of that place. The bed where I'd once waited for her to come home. The kitchen where her betrayal had simmered behind every glance and casual conversation. The walls that had absorbed years of hurt and deception. And I felt nothing. Not grief, not nostalgia, not regret. Just vacancy, like a room that had been thoroughly cleaned and was now ready for new occupants. I moved into a new apartment overlooking the river. Smaller and cleaner than our old house, with wide windows that let light in exactly the way I needed it. There were no shared memories embedded in these walls. No echoes of someone else's voice. No ghosts of arguments or reconciliations. I bought new furniture and painted the walls in colors I actually liked. I left spaces blank on purpose, not because I couldn't afford to fill them, but because I wasn't in a hurry to fill every corner with meaning. Some corners are meant to stay empty for a while to remind you that space itself has value. One afternoon, Catherine stopped by my new place. She brought coffee and a folder of final documents for me to sign. Loose ends from the legal proceedings that had entangled our two divorces. She looked stronger than when I'd first met her, still tired but upright in a way I hadn't seen before. We sat on my balcony, and we didn't talk much about Victoria or Blake. There was nothing left to say about them. The chapter of our lives that had involved those two people was closed, and we were both moving forward. "I'm thinking of moving," Catherine said after we'd sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow beneath us. "New city, new job, new everything." "You should," I replied without hesitation. "You deserve it." She smiled at that, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since this whole situation had begun. "So do you," she said. After Catherine left, I stood at the edge of my balcony for a long time. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. The river below moved cold and fast, indifferent to the human drama that played out along its banks. And standing there, I realized something that felt like a fundamental shift in my understanding of myself. Survival doesn't mean you're healed. It just means you've stopped bleeding. Healing is something else entirely. It's slower, quieter, more deliberate. It's found in the little things that you don't even notice at first. It's in cooking a meal for one person and still making it good, still taking care with the seasoning and presentation. It's in sleeping through the night without unconsciously reaching for a phantom presence beside you. It's in looking in the mirror and not seeing someone who failed, but someone who endured something difficult and came out the other side intact. Victoria called once more after the divorce was officially finalized. Just a missed call with no message attached. I didn't call her back, and I felt no curiosity about what she might have wanted to say. There was no hate left in me, no bitterness, no desire for revenge or closure or final words. Just silence. The good kind this time. The kind that feels like peace rather than abandonment. I sat at my desk that night and opened a notebook to a fresh page. I wrote 5 words in clear, deliberate handwriting. She doesn't live here anymore. Not in my head, not in my chest, not in my plans for the future. She was a chapter I'd read too many times, hoping for a different ending. But the ink had never changed no matter how many times I'd turned those pages. Now I was writing something else entirely, a story that belonged only to me. There was no dramatic finale to this experience, no storm of emotion or fireworks of resolution. The final chapter didn't arrive with shouting or slamming doors or grand gestures of any kind. It arrived with something much more valuable, a quiet, clean breath. I found myself sitting on a bench by the river one morning, the same place I'd started walking to every day after moving into my new apartment. The sun was coming up, bleeding through the fog and painting the water gold. I had a cup of coffee in my hand. Not from any fancy shop, just black coffee I'd brewed at home. It tasted better than any overpriced latte I used to sip while trying to ignore the knots of anxiety that had lived permanently in my stomach during those final months with Victoria. I opened my phone and saw one of those memory notifications that social media platforms send out. Algorithmic time bombs that are meant to be cute but are often cruel. It was a photo from 4 years ago. Victoria and me standing in front of some vineyard during a weekend trip. She was smiling, pressed against me. Her eyes lit up with whatever lie she was telling herself that day about our happiness. Back then, I'd thought we were genuinely happy in that moment. But now I understood that wasn't a photo of us being happy together. That was a photo of me trying, desperately and alone, to create something real with someone who was already gone. I deleted the photo. Not with anger, not with regret. Just because I didn't need it anymore. Her name hadn't come up in my thoughts in weeks. The world had moved on. Friends had stopped asking how I was holding up, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and genuine. Catherine and I kept in touch occasionally, but not out of trauma, bonding, or shared victimhood. It was genuine mutual respect between two people who had helped each other stay sane when their lives fell through the floor. We didn't need to keep talking constantly. We just knew that we'd been there for each other when it mattered most, and that understanding created a bond that didn't require constant maintenance. Victoria never tried to contact me again after that final missed call, and I finally understood why. She knew. She knew that I had outgrown the space she used to occupy in my life. She understood that whatever version of me would have begged, clung, or compromised endlessly to keep her. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the difference between love and dependency. I didn't rebuild myself for revenge or to prove anything to her. I rebuilt myself because I deserved to exist without carrying her damage around like a weight I'd volunteered to bear. I deserved to live without being constantly measured by her moods, her games, her betrayals, or her version of what I should be. I stopped asking the questions that had tormented me for months. Why she did it, what it all meant, whether it could have been avoided if I'd been different somehow. Those questions had kept me trapped in her narrative, forever trying to solve a puzzle that had been designed to be unsolvable. Here's the truth that most people never say out loud. Closure isn't something you get from the person who hurt you. It's something you choose for yourself. And I chose it. Not because I'd forgiven everything she'd done, but because I didn't want to carry any of it into the rest of my life. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I read more books, slept deeper, took my time at the grocery store without thinking about what she might want for dinner. I learned that the quiet in my apartment wasn't empty space that needed to be filled. It was full of freedom, possibility, and the simple pleasure of being myself without apology. One morning, I looked in the mirror and saw a man I recognized again. Not perfect, not finished with the work of healing, but real and steady. Someone who had been tested and had chosen to remain kind despite being hurt. Someone who had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. If you're reading this and going through something similar, if you're trying to make sense of betrayal, gaslighting, or the way someone can lie straight through your heart and still smile at dinner, I want you to hear me clearly. It's not your fault. You didn't fail by loving them completely. You only fail if you forget to love yourself afterward. The pain doesn't last forever, though it feels like it will. The confusion, the nights you spend replaying every word and gesture, the ache in your chest that feels like it might be permanent, it all passes. Slowly at first, then all at once, like a fever that breaks in the middle of the night. One day, you'll look back at the person who hurt you and realize something profound. They didn't break you. They freed you. They showed you exactly who they were beneath all the masks and promises. And in doing so, they gave you permission to stop pretending that their version of love was something you needed to accept. That's what Victoria did for me in the end. She gave me the worst of herself, her cruelest truths and most selfish impulses. And in doing so, she reminded me to give everything back to myself. My energy, my trust, my hope for the future. She is gone now, completely and permanently. And I have never been more present in my own life, more here in my own skin, more ready for whatever comes next. The story doesn't end with revenge or dramatic confrontation. It ends with something much more valuable. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive the worst someone has to offer and still choose to remain open to the best that life has to give.